Hello, Dr. Dellinger and classmates. Thank you all for taking the time to watch my presentation. I have chosen to do my research on the countercultural Indian trope as described by Philip Deloria in Chapter 6 of Playing Indian. And in particular, I want to examine this trope and its usage in queer culture and media. Before I do so, I want to clarify for anyone who might be concerned that I myself am a queer trans man. So when I offer critique of the queer community, I'm doing so as an insider with a heart full of love for my own people. But with that out of the way, the start from beginning, here we go. The countercultural Indian trope is described by Deloria using examples of Cold War era counterculture movements, in particular the communalist movements, in which large groups of predominantly white and almost entirely non-Indigenous radicals would pack up altogether and go to a relatively off-the-grid location and attempt to create a utopical society there, in which principles of communal living and harmony and togetherness were really the stated goal. And when they did so, a lot of communalist movements would use symbols and icons and structures from Native American cultures to mark themselves as existing in as a counterpart or an opposition to the more shallow consumeristic mainstream American culture that they were trying to leave behind. So the slide image here is of a handful of teepees set up on the New Buffalo commune, which again was built almost entirely by non-Indigenous people. And the reason they use the teepees, according to Deloria, is not because they were particularly good at building teepees, they tended to leak, or because they were practical as long-term residences where they had set up, but because the teepee was being utilized as a symbol of opposition to American imperialism and consumerist culture, that they were relying on the image of Indianness as a counterculture marker, to label themselves as existing counter to the culture they had left behind. And I think there's a pretty similar mechanic going on in the founding of the Radical Fairies by one Harry Hay. The Radical Fairies were a neo-pagan movement founded by gay activist Harry Hay and his partner John Burnside. They are depicted here looking lovingly into each other's eyes. And it was intended to create a new social role for gay men as kind of a counterpoint to the social role they were forced into by the homophobic society of America in the mid-60s onward. For example, they call themselves the Radical Fairies because they're reclaiming the word fairy as it's been used as a slur against gay men. Where I see the countercultural Indian trope at play here is in their intent and actualized usage of what they perceive to be indigenous third gender groups. So, for example, in his book, When Did Indians Become Straight? Mark Rifkin lifts out a manifesto that Harry Hay wrote called Remarks on a Third Gender, which Hay claims first and foremost, it's time we took a leaf from the lessons third gender brothers in other cultures have to teach us and how to re-earn the respect and gratitude of our hetero communities for the different people that we are. So right off the bat, we have the stated intent to examine indigenous cultures in particular for third gender roles in order to learn a new way to be in community and sociality with each other to gain for better respect from the broader hetero community. He goes on to say difference as like a plural noun, people who are different. Difference would be men of a third gender, and so they are still perceived and loved and treasured by the largest tribe of Native Americans in the American Southwest today, the Diné. So we also have a claim here from Hay that the third gender social role he wants to be able to embody with the Radical Fairies and their community already exists in Diné or Navajo culture. It concludes with, I propose that we gay men of all colors prepare to present ourselves as the gentle, non-competitive third gender men of the Western world. And I added the bolding on the Western world here because I think it's important to note that his hypothetical embodying of this third gender that he sees or thinks he sees in indigenous cultures, his vision isn't to share it with indigenous people or any other cultures anywhere else in the world. This is a specific goal that he has for gay men in the Western world, gay men of his particular cultural heritage. This is something he wants to lift this aspect of indigenous culture, this supposed third gender of the DNA, that he, as he understands it, as a marker to use for himself and his community, to mark them as against or outside of the traditional social role that Western American culture has given gay men. You know, the third gender suppositions here are acting in kind of the same capacity as the TPs for the communalists. We see a subtler, but I think still relevant example of the countercultural Indian trope in Stone Butch Blues. It's a groundbreaking novel by Leslie Feinberg. The main character of the novel is named Jess. Jess is a pretty overt self-insert on Feinberg's part. And there is a portion of the narrative, it's only about 5 or 6 pages long, in which Jess is working in a factory and many of her coworkers are indigenous women of the Six Nations. And Jess develops a massive crush on one of them named Yvonne. And in the same page that Yvonne is introduced, Jess comments, "I think all of the women noticed right away," indicating that these indigenous women that are her coworkers are aware of her queer sexuality. They know what it means that Jess is a butch lesbian, and they seem unfazed by it throughout the narrative, and even encouraging of her embodying her identity and attraction. There's a notable part of the book where Jess is asked to lead the singing in a singing circle that they often do at the beginning of their workday, indicating that they know exactly who and what Jess is and still wants to not only include her in their culture, but honor her as part of it. And then, of course, invoking the vanishing Indian trope, once this part of the narrative ends and Jess is fired from the factory and leaves, these people are never seen or heard from again. What they do, and Mark Rifkin also comments on this section in his book, When Did Indians Become Straight? Rifkin comments, "The apparent ability to embrace non-heteronormative gender and sexual identity marks Native sociality as an ideal prototype for the kind of community Feinberg seeks to generate." So the role of these women, as they appear briefly in the narrative and offer this oasis of acceptance to Jess and then vanish, is not to be consistent presences in the world that Jess is inhabiting. It's to be a model, a prototype, a utopic ideal of a culture that could exist if Jess and by extension Feinberg can create it in mainstream American culture. It doesn't involve the co-opting of any particular indigenous role the way that Harry Hay uses the label of third gender, but it does involve seeing an aspect of how they perceive Native culture. It does involve seeing this utopic queer acceptance that Feinberg and the character Jess are longing for and seeking to transplant that out of that culture into their own. We see a similar mechanic in an absolute train wreck of a movie called Transamerica from 2005. I want to go on the record right now as saying I do not recommend anyone watch this movie. I just think it's interesting for study purposes. It follows the story of a transgender woman named Bree going on a cross-country road trip with her estranged son, Toby, who does not know that Bree is his parent or that she's a trans woman. So when it is revealed to Toby that Bree is trans and he reacts very negatively to it, Bree delivers this monologue. She says, "Many societies throughout history have honored and revered transgendered people, the Zulu, the Yoruba. The Native Americans called us two-spirit people. Then the settlers came, they tended to murder us on sight." I've added bolding again on the word us, because I think there are two really important assertions taking place in here. First, Bree is claiming that the phrase two spirits can be rightly and accurately applied to white binary transgender people, and then claiming a shared history with these historical two-spirit people that she thinks she would have been a part of in another time, in another life. She says the Native Americans called us two-spirit people. But when the settlers came, they tended to murder us on sight. She is claiming kinship and allegiance, not with the settlers doing the murdering, even though those are her direct ancestors and the founders of the culture that she's a part of, but rather with the indigenous two-spirit people. It's a claiming of an identity and a history that represents a countercultural ideal for her, that as opposed to the mainstream American culture, which has been so brutal towards her, this idealized history of two-spirit identity represents another cultural way of being that she can aspire to. Issue, of course, being that Bree is incorrect about the usage of this term. Here is a Cherokee two-spirit scholar, Dr. Quoley Driscoll, who explains in their book, Sovereign Erotics, spectacular book, I highly recommend it, that first of all, the phrase two-spirit was not coined until 1990 in a conference at Winnipeg attended by many queer and two-spirit indigenous people. Furthermore, Driscoll explains, the term two-spirit is a word that resists colonial definitions of who we are. It is an expression, let me move myself here. It is an expression of our sexual and gender identities as sovereign of those GLBT movements. The coinage of the word was never meant to create a monolithic understanding of the array of Native traditions regarding what dominant European and Euro-American traditions call alternative genders and sexualities. The phrase two-spirit can't be accurately applied to white binary trans people of settler colonial descent. The whole purpose of the phrase two-spirit is to mark particular identities that exist within indigenous communities as sovereign and distinct from more mainstream Western queer rights movements. And by lifting this phrase two-spirit to describe ourselves, non-Indigenous queer people are actually committing an affront on the sovereignty of not only that phrase, but the people who use it. And it's not entirely uncommon to see non-Indigenous queer people reach for both the word two-spirit and this kind of idealized utopic past they imagine, where queer identity was not rejected, but rather honored and celebrated by Indigenous people throughout time. I've called this slide Fantasies of Belonging, referencing that's the mechanic that I think is at play here, that when queer people, commit this act of playing Indian, as Deloria describes it, and co-opt Indigenous language and concepts and cultural norms to attach themselves to another culture and history and way of being. It's a fantasy of belonging to a history and a culture that accepts us rather than reviles us. And I think it's not entirely unexpected to see that happen in a group of people that have been rejected by their own culture. The issue, as explained by Deloria here, is, but just as often as they engaged real Indian people, white radicals joined the communalists in placing their highest premium upon a detached symbolic Indianness. So here's a couple of examples I've pulled up from pop culture. For example, here is Jason Mraz, a white pop singer, opening up about his two-spirit sexuality. God bless him. Here's an article from Gender GP. It's a medical resource website for trans and non-binary people that right off the bat in this article conflates the history of non-binary people in the Western world with the history of two-spirit people in indigenous cultures. Here's a popular YouTuber, Natalie Wynn, embodying a non-binary character, advocating for the legitimacy of non-binary identity and claiming for thousands of years there have been third gender groups across human cultures. There's the Hijra of India and the two-spirit people among Native Americans. And then all of these examples, we're seeing non-Indigenous queer people attaching themselves to kind of an imagined history of two-spirit people in order to lay claim to a sort of mythic past, a utopic gone society in which queer people are wanted and honored and respected. But in doing so, they are not only affronting the sovereignty of actual Two-Spirit people, but leaving behind the indigenous people that actually embody these categories as they exist in their own cultures. I think it's a trend that the queer community can and should move past. Thank you for listening. Here's my bibliography, and I will post discussion questions in a separate document. I'm pausing.